Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted this evening to be with Professor Justin Barrett. I've been following his work for many, many years, and he is someone that is quite well known, not only in the academic world, but also in popular culture, due to some of the discussions that have been happening around his research. So, firstly, thank you so much, Professor, for joining me on this live stream.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Just going to share my screen. So Professor Barrett is the Thrive Professor of Development Science and Director of the Thrive Center for Human Development in Fuller Theological Seminary School of Psychology, an experimental psychologist, PhD from Cornell University. Barrett taught for 5 years in Oxford University School of Anthropology and is best known for his research on religion. And as some of you may remember, for viewers of this channel, the very popular debate discussion between Jordan Peterson and Muhammad Hijab. Your work actually came up as one of the points of discussion as well. So you're quite well known in the popular discourse as well. So welcome. You have written this fantastic book, and I would love for the viewers to order it and to actually go through it. So firstly, Professor, why did you write this book?
Well, thanks for asking, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. I wrote the book because in my own personal experience and in the conversations I've had with lots of people of faith from a lot of different traditions. Mostly I've spoken to Christians, but I know it sort of transfers to other faiths as well. And that is that a lot of, especially young people going into the sciences, think that maybe doing a scientific kind of career isn't for them because of their faith commitments, that there's something, even if there's not a full-on conflict between the sciences and their faith, that maybe it's just not a worthy calling. Or if they do go into the sciences, they think that somehow they have to bracket their faith off from the sciences and do science in a sort of a very different kind of way. That isn't, well, I use the word integrated. It's not integrated with their faith perspective, their worldview, and their values. So it's almost like they have to code shift. Okay, now I'm a scientist, and now I'm a Christian. Now I'm a scientist, now I'm a Muslim. Now I'm a scientist, now I'm Jewish. Whatever it is, that there's this code shift that has to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to write the book as an encouragement to especially young people of faith who are considering the sciences to start asking themselves a little bit deeper questions about what does it mean for your faith to fuel a scientific career? How can it inspire or inflect your career? How can it motivate your career? And the way you think about what it means to do the sciences. So that's kind of, big sloppy brushstrokes. That's what the book is about. And mostly it came out of that personal kind of, gee, I wish I'd had this book when I was 17, 18, 19 years old. So, when you discover those things in life, maybe it's a good thing to do something about it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I found really interesting about the book, the way that you actually structured it, is it's quite clear under each chapter, what are the objectives, what are you trying to do? And it's quite concise like that. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is one of the really interesting points that you make is about, would scientific study lead me to encounter and worship God? Now, we've obviously been told from the time we're pretty much aware of science and religion that actually these two are loggerheads and they don't really dovetail together and whatnot. And you take this on heads on, and you actually quote a geneticist, Ruth Bantzwitz, she actually says something really interesting. She says, awe is an important part of the experience of science. One could almost say it's universal. When a scientist feels awe, it's usually in response to something complex, precise, ordered, powerful, or beautiful. There is an element of unexpectedness and delight. maybe even respect, fear, or reverence. So, you're taking a totally different angle. You're just going full into actually science should be inspiring you and has inspired people in the past.
That's right. And lots of scientists who are people of faith often report these kinds of experiences in their scientific work and as motivations for their scientific work, whether it's looking through a microscope at something really, really tiny and making this sort of awe at the intricacy of the littlest things, or the awe at the grandeur and spectacle of some of the biggest things when we look through a telescope and see distant galaxies or stars being born. There's this, wow, there's more to this world than sort of immediately meets the eye. It's more complex, it's larger, it's grander. And at least for a lot of us, that speaks to, well, and there's a beauty about it as well, right? And all of those things, awe, beauty, the sublime, they all can prompt many of us anyway to feel like, well, this is moving us toward worship. This is moving us toward imagining, thinking, grappling with the someone or something else that's behind it all. And so I find this is actually a really common theme among many scientists who have religious faiths, that they see this kind of awe, beauty, wonder, grandeur in the natural world, and their science is a way that they can pursue that and discover that. And for me personally, I do have one of these sort of late adolescent kind of experiences in a high school science class, even just being awed at my own hand. That sounds, I don't mean that in a sort of narcissistic way. Well, I've got a really cool hand. It's not that. It's that this is a really complex, marvelous machine that I have attached to my own body. And for some reason, I was struck just in class, and I remember it to this day, of just the awesomeness of, well, what I take to be God's creation in that moment. So yes, I think, and I'm not alone in this, there are lots of us who think that drive to experience the natural world, to encounter the complexity, the intricacy of it, and sort of the elegance of it in some ways, can be at least moving toward a worshipful kinds of experience. So it doesn't need to push us away, it can push us toward. Now, I'm quick to say, yes, artists have done this too. Non-scientists have these experiences as well, but many scientists do. So at least that's a place to start.
Yeah. And it's interesting as well on this point that you can have someone who's an ardent atheist like Richard Dawkins, yet when they're speaking about, what they see in the natural world, they also use poetic and almost religious-like language to describe the feelings that are evoked when they look at nature. So
Yeah.
this is a cross-cultural thing, and it's sort of theologically neutral starting point that someone may have, but they'll still have the same sort of experiences. One of the things that you say, which is quite brave, as a well-known public figure and a scientist, is you don't just go into how science can inspire us for worship. You actually talk about how science almost needs some foundational assumptions which are grounded in theism.
Yeah, I think this is a point that it's often missed. But I understand you've got some interests in philosophy of science, and I think I'm on pretty good ground here. That if we look carefully at what it is, or the sort of background assumptions behind even doing the scientific enterprise at all, there are a number of metaphysical, is the jargon, right, assumptions that we make that are sort of pre-scientific. Yeah. And so it's not an accident that what we call modern science emerged where it did, when it did, sort of historically, culturally, and so forth. Historians will point out that the Chinese were more advanced than people in the West were at the same time. And yet modern science didn't grow up there. It grew up because of this interesting collision between Greek thought, Arabic thought, and Christian thought. And And of course it's a complex story, but part of that were these assumptions like there's a knowable real world out there.
Yeah.
Why do science if the world isn't knowable, if we're living in the matrix or something like that, and it's all an illusion or whatever that it is? And not just that there's a real world out there, but that it's a knowable real world that is somehow ordered, that it's not random, it's not chaotic. Lots of worldviews have thought that fundamentally the world is chaotic. And so that's not very good grounds for motivating scientific kind of inquiry, especially trying to discover laws. But at least in the Abrahamic traditions, we share this heritage of, no, God created, he ordered the chaos. We have an orderly world. And that order is something that we can at least begin to grasp, in part because of our nature, because of how we were created by God. And that gives us grounds for having optimism about doing the scientific enterprise. So we think there's a real world. We think that we're not God, so we can't just figure it out from our armchairs, but we have to actually go out and explore it and risk being wrong, because we will be, and empirically investigate it. But we have an expectation that it'll be orderly and relatively stable. We expect that the past was like things are now, and the future will be like things are now. And so it's okay to talk about retrodicting and predicting using scientific methods. If we discover something right now, we don't think that 2 years from now we have to rerun all of the experiments all over again because the world will have radically changed. No, we can build on this scientific enterprise as we go, because that of the relative stability of the cosmos, of this order that is created into the world. And yet we have these human limitations. Our minds, like I said, we're not gods. We have limited minds with all of the brokenness of being a human being. And so we need methods that then help us discern those regularities, that wisdom that's been built into the creation by the Creator. So from this kind of Abrahamic worldview, there's lots of good philosophical, I think, stuff, foundations for being enthusiastic about the scientific enterprise. And one of the things that I want to help readers see as they think about their own worldview, whatever that is that not all worldviews actually fit that well with those assumptions.
Yeah.
And it follows, I think, that not all worldviews are equally sort of at home with the sciences. And the uncomfortable sort of surprise that I don't talk about in this book, I'm saving it for sort of the grown-up version of the book, is for scientists further down the path, I should put it that way. But actually having an atheistic, materialistic worldview is a less comfortable kind of worldview, I think, for doing the sciences. So it's just the opposite of what I think a lot of people assume.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're definitely on some safe philosophical ground there. The book I would recommend it for anyone who wants to go off on this tangent about the philosophical assumptions required by science, which have a theological touch to them, is Peter Harrison's book, Science Without Religion, Rethinking the History of Scientific Naturalism. I interviewed Harrison a few months ago, and this is well established, I believe, through his arguments and arguments of others, that not only do we need to make a whole host of assumptions about ontology, the world being real, the world being rationally accessible, but also a moral drive to actually research the world, and a moral drive that there is goodness in searching for cures for humanity. And I believe it's a verse of the Bible. I could be incorrect in this, but consciousness of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? So that Abrahamic paradigm, that actually all knowledge begins off with some form of theistic opening, some sort of epistemic opening, which begins off with a belief in God. And about the uneasiness between naturalism and science, it's something not very hard to get. You don't have to go very far to actually start discovering it. Alvin Plantinga, for example, speaks about uneasiness between evolutionary theory and naturalism. I mean, evolutionary theory can fit with theism. Asa Gray and others, I'm sure you're aware of, didn't really see a problem with that. But there's lots of philosophical problems you can come across if you just start off with this sort of hardcore naturalism. So that is page 28 for anybody who's interested in reading this book, and it's quite interesting about how theological beliefs are required for us having to basically do science. Now, you touch a little bit about the limitations of our knowledge, but also that we have a lot more capacity for scientific discovery than what is required to survive and reproduce, right? And that in of itself is, we're not saying it's hardcore evidence, but it's an indication that if it's better with belief in God to be doing science than not.
Yeah, it's one of these, I don't know, it's sort of a happy discovery in some ways, right? That if we really think through the successes of the sciences, it does seem to, they outstrip what is strictly necessary for us. And that's a remarkable thing if we pause for a moment. Humans have been around for, depending on who you talk to, but certainly in the sciences, they would say we've been around for an awful long time. Behaviorally modern humans, maybe 300,000 years. Maybe it's only 100,000, whatever the number is, it's a long time. And modern science has been around for a few hundred years. And so we don't, strictly speaking, need it to do just fine in the world. And yet here it is, being very productive and leading to evidently lots of really interesting discoveries. And yet it's built on a certain kind of theological foundation. That seems like a happy accident in some ways. And as you say, this isn't, some amazing argument or proof for theism or anything else, but it's worth considering. It's, I think, also worth considering because we haven't had the sciences for ever and ever, and because we've done pretty well without them. It is worth being a little bit humble about the deliverances of the sciences and how important they are. Right? I'm clearly a scientist and a scientific enthusiast, but we're living in an age where we've got scientific triumphalists who are wanting to go the next step and say, the science is the most important thing going. We have to devote all of our resources to the sciences. Without scientific discoveries, we're nothing. It will solve all of our problems, whatever it is at that point. And I think whoa, easy. You earlier alluded to the sort of the moral requirements for motivations and requirements for doing the sciences as well. We can't forget that. The sciences are good tools for making lots of discoveries. But they don't tell us what we should study. They don't tell us how we should draw the implications of those studies. They don't tell us what technologies we should develop because of these studies. They don't tell us what policies we should be making. Those are all ethical types of considerations that have to draw upon the value systems of the scientists and the people who use the sciences. And so we want to be careful there. While we remain enthusiastic. But back to the sort of the main thread, I think many people of faith have good reason to be enthusiastic and good reason to think we do have the appropriate kinds of values to appropriately use the sciences as good tools. I approach these as thinking the sciences are very good tools that I think God has given to us. But like any good tool, you need to use it appropriately, where it's supposed to be used, what it's supposed to be used for, and you got to take care of the tool. If you've got a complex tool, you got to keep it clean. You got to use it properly. Your car has to be serviced periodically for it to keep running properly. You can't just use it for anything you want. And I think there's some helpful reflection that needs to happen in that too. And hopefully readers of the book will see that I'm trying to lead you through those kinds of reflections.
Yeah.
But sorry, I went sideways a little bit I took a detour.
No, you didn't. I mean, in fact, that was going to be my next question. But just going back a few steps to our previous point that we were discussing about survivability and the capacity that we have. A interesting historical tidbit maybe enlightening to bring in here, which is Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection alongside Darwin. He actually doubted natural selection's ability later on, after they published the actual theory, and he doubted the ability of natural selection to generate mind, because of the fact that you could take these people who were called savages at the time from South America, bring them to UK, bring them to Europe, and they could have the same sort of cognitive architecture and the same abilities that their European counterparts would have. So Russell Wallace basically thought this doesn't make any sense, because if natural selection was the sole mechanism at play, then they should not have that ability to, do higher level analytical maths and all these types of things. So that's just within the naturalistic domain. He wasn't a believer in God. That's just him within his capacity thinking, actually, there's something more than this. Now, going to the other point that you raised about the limitations of science, there's actually an entire section you have on this on page 48. But just to summarize, and maybe you can add some points to this, there's obviously logic is not science. Logic is required by science. Mathematics is required by science. These are before you do the science. Then there are metaphysical assumptions about the uniformity of nature, about other aspects of reality. Then there is obviously this very clear understanding that we have that science must be done in context of the work of other scientists. So we accept the testimony of other scientists. We don't scientifically test every single experiment by ourselves. So if someone is to say science is the be all and end all, you couldn't accept the testimony of other scientists. You couldn't rely on logic and mathematics, and you couldn't basically rely on a whole bunch of metaphysical assumptions about reality. So this is a type of scientism, or I think you called it science triumphant, Trumpism, or whatever. I'm not sure what term you used, but we are not knocking science. We're just saying it has its place and its context, but don't make it. I believe in one of your interviews with Lawrence Kuhn on PBS, when it came to evolutionary explanations of religion, you were accepting those explanations, but you said to be careful with the word fully. Like science doesn't fully explain all of reality.
Yeah, that's right. All science is provisional. It's typically probabilistic, and it's preliminary and constantly changing. And so and that's what the history of science shows, right? Is that we're always making, while we're building, there's sort of a ratcheting effect that happens. There are big steps backwards or to the side when we make discoveries that just sort of don't fit the evidence anymore. We have these little micro revolutions and all of these other kinds of things. So we have to be careful there. And you're quite right. There are plenty of other ways to know things that are not scientific, but that doesn't make them wrong. I take it that most of us, if we see, say, historical studies done very well, that's not science, but that can be empirically rigorous and it can still produce knowledge. We can trust our memory faculties for most of our day-to-day kinds of lives. I do love the little example. Lots of people have used this one, but the whole "what did you eat for breakfast?" and we don't scientifically know what we ate for breakfast. We know it from our memory, and we're entitled to those kinds of memories. How do you know that your mother loves you? You didn't scientifically determine that your mother loves you, but I think you're on safe ground most of the time. I mean, there are sad exceptions to this, but most of us probably have mothers who love us, and we're perfectly rational in thinking that they do. So you're quite right. There are other ways of knowing things. And it doesn't do the sciences any good if we put the pressure on them to be the end-all be-all way of either knowing things or determining how we should live our lives. That ultimately undercuts and undermines the utility of the sciences when we ask them to do things that they're not well equipped to do, because they will fail. And then that erodes trust and everything else.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, for anybody who wants to go off into that direction about the sort of limitations of science in a practical context. And I would recommend an academic at your old institution of Oxford, John Lennox. His book, Has Science Buried God? He does a really good job of going over, what is legitimate scientific questioning and reasoning, and what isn't, and why those questions are still relevant. Because sometimes we get this idea that if something's not scientific, then therefore it's not important. Another interesting thing I found, which was something unexpected in the book, but it is a really nice thing to have in there, is how your belief in God can actually help you better treat other scientists.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, tough that it's something we have to struggle with and continually to work out. Much of the structure of the book, you've read it, but for those who haven't, I structure the book around a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
And because I really want to encourage readers to reflect on these questions for themselves, to answer them for themselves, I offer some of how I begin to address these questions, but I'm not assuming that I can answer all these questions for everyone. But I've borrowed some of the big organizing ideas from C. Stephen Evans, a philosopher, who identified these different sort of faces of psychological science in particular, but many of them transfer to other sciences, especially those that study humans in one way or another. One of the things that was not part of his original treatment was this section that you're referring to. And this was one that I had to sort of experientially discover. And that is, insofar as the sciences are a social enterprise, and we often forget that. We're often sort of taught science in a way that emphasizes the pioneering individual. But the sciences really proceed as a socially distributed kind of enterprise in which you check my work, I check your work, we collaborate together, we compete to a certain extent with each other. Different labs try to solve a problem before other labs. They will sometimes share findings and so forth, but we go through this peer review process. There are lots of ways in which it's socially distributed, and there are very good reasons for this. They include that, especially that we often do not see the weaknesses in our own studies and our own arguments very well, but we see the weaknesses in others pretty well. It's part of our self-serving biases. And then, so for, I guess we're coming up on about 3 decades of me doing this kind of work. Mm-hmm. I've had lots of engagement with colleagues where I have found that I have to really consider, well, how am I going to treat my colleagues in this space? And how does my Christian faith inform how I interact with those colleagues? Am I treating them appropriately? Am I, loving them as my collegial neighbors, as it were, as myself? Because it can be a very confrontational business. I mean, I don't think we're quite as vicious as certain kinds of philosophers can be, but there is a certain kind of no nonsense, show me the data. An attack on my thinking feels like an attack on me personally, or at least it can come across that way if we're not careful. We almost train our doctoral students to score points in their dissertation by tearing other people down. And there are lots of different kinds of enculturated habits that I think ultimately are not the way we're supposed to be treating other human beings. Mm-hmm. At least from my faith perspective, right? That if we're not treating them as people created in God's image that we're supposed to express love and care for. And so it's a struggle. I'm confessing it's a bit of a struggle for me to put it out there that sometimes, there's am I going to put, one of my colleagues on blast because of something they've written or something they've said? Okay, dial it back, give the most charitable reading possible of their work. I try to. That's one of the things I try to do is give a charitable reading. I try to give a constructive reading So I'm like, even if I disagree with it, can I take what they've done and sort of add to it or modify it in some way so that it strengthens what it is, and still give them credit for they helped me see this new idea, even though I disagreed with them in some important ways, that I wouldn't have got where I was thinking wise or discovery wise without their help. Am I keeping those kinds of ideas in mind? Can I see past disagreements and still treat the person like a human being? And there are really some concrete steps that we can take in this regard. And some of that is just, well, it's this humanizing. We sit down and we have coffee or tea with somebody. We, have a meal with them. We ask them about things that they're interested in outside of their academic life, so that we start to see them as a multidimensional kind of human being instead of just a brain on a stick that walks around or something, whatever it is. I'll confess, part of my sort of journey in this, part of my discovery was going to, it was a Society for Research and Child Development meeting. I've only been to one, I think, in my, even though I've done some developmental psychology, I think I've only been to one of these meetings. And I'd been to many academic meetings before this, but it was still fairly early in my career. And one of the things I noticed about this conference was that people seemed to be friendlier, and they were, asking each other about their kids and, their spouses. And they're just the whole vibe of the big convention center space in which people were mingling had a warmer, more humane kind of a feel about it. And so that was one thing I noticed right away, and that struck me as a really positive thing. The second thing that I noticed then was that I was one of the tallest people in the room. And then it dawned on me, and it really did go in this order, that, oh, this is the first academic conference I've been at that is about 90% women. Because child development researchers are mostly women, it turns out. It's one of these few areas of the academic world that women outnumber men by a huge proportion. But I think there was something about that taught me something. It was like, oh, if women academics can be nice to each other and treat each other like human beings, I think men need to step up, and we can do some of that too. But sorry, there's just a little story. But more genuinely, yes, I think that drawing on the resources of my faith to sort of challenge myself, how can I treat my even those colleagues out there who view me as a competitor or even an enemy, is something that I need to handle. It's part of the job, and it's part of then what it means for me, at least, to live my Christian faith in this space.
Absolutely. And going back to the title, how can faith fuel scientific discovery? Why what we just mentioned is important for that particular question, because scientists have to work together. They don't work in silos. In order for science to flourish, it's dependent upon the cohesion and the collaboration of scientists working together, as opposed to being at odds with each other. And what's interesting is, if we go back to some scientists like Stephen Jay Gould and others, one of the motivating factors for their ideas flourishing was that they wanted theists and atheists and people from all different backgrounds to just get on with it, right? Just make the world a better place. Don't make it into a theological battleground between new atheism and religious people. Just work together and, try and just improve the condition of humanity. So that's why, faith can actually curtail those types of the sort of scientific competition that happens, and other sort of problems that can happen, and can make you into a better person. Now, one of the things that you were known for that really made you popular many years ago, I think back in 2012, was actually your work on Born Believers, your actual work there. So I wanted to ask you some questions related from that book to this one. Obviously, the argument, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to make a mistake in terms of representing your view here, but I believe the argument that you were making, and I've seen this in the interviews as well, you're not making the argument that actually this means it gives legitimacy to the idea of God, that we have this born believer sort of God-shaped hole or whatever it is. It doesn't argue for God. But could you say that it can that this can fuel scientific discovery, because we have this idea that God created things, so we need to discover those things?
Could you say a little more about that? I'm intrigued.
Okay, so one of the things I think you mentioned in your interviews is about how we have a natural affinity to things like dance, right? It's very easy for us to pick up, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I don't remember the words you used, but I'm just going to paraphrase it. You can correct me if I'm not describing it correctly. It's almost like we have some innate structure, and that innate structure, when it gets a cultural input, whether it's dance or religion, then because we have that innate disposition, then it comes out. So the dance comes out, or the art comes out, or the belief in God comes out, right? So likewise, the question I'm asking is it then also the case that when we see nature, we see people studying nature, just like dance is evoked, we also get this feeling to want to do science because it's something within us?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. No, I don't think I would go there.
Okay.
And let me try to quickly explain why. So part of the Born Believers thesis, the Born Believers book is my take on what you might call the naturalness of religion thesis. And I'm not alone in advancing variations of this thesis. Robert Macaulay has a great book on the naturalness of science, or the naturalness of religion and the unnaturalness of science is his title. But he advances this naturalness thesis. Pascal Boyer has, Jesse Bering has, lots of people working in this cognitive and evolutionary studies of religion space have variations on the theme. And what they tend to have in common is the idea that by virtue of being human beings, we get certain kinds of psychological machinery that's just part of, kind of the human equipment, at least under typical developmental conditions. And that equipment sort of inclines us toward certain kinds of beliefs and practices that we recognize as religious. Okay, that's a very broad brushstroke. I use the analogy of dance recently because I think it helps make the case clear, make the argument clear. And that is, so just like humans are unusual in the degree to which we move rhythmically, very few animals actually do this spontaneously or at all. We tend to synchronize our movements with other people as well. So we move in rhythm with other people. And there's good evidence of this from, you can generate your own by, sort of dropping a fat beat with toddlers around and watch what they do. They start moving rhythmically to this, or just start clapping your hands and other people will clap along with it. It's a very peculiar type of thing. And we know that humans, when they move in synchrony together, there's experimental evidence that suggests that actually increases their feelings of bondedness to each other. We get nice, happy hormones moving through our brains and bodies that make us feel unified with people. So we get positive feedback for doing things that start looking like dance. And so with a little bit of, you can imagine a time where people start with these kinds of inklings. Maybe some pioneers start doing something with music and dance, and then others, that becomes the cultural context in which then dance propagates. But it's building on these interesting psychological building blocks that are there that we seem to all share, basically. Yep. Similarly, something seems to be going on with religious beliefs. We see design and purpose in the natural world. That seems to be a natural part of just the human equipment, is we're seeking out design and purpose. And we readily attach that design and purpose we see in the natural world to someone did it. So then we've got this conceptual gap of who is the someone. It's easy for us in childhood to think about the someone as being as not having a physical body of the normal sort, or being, visibly present. That actually is really not a problem for children. And the list goes on. And so I detailed that in the Born Believers book. But the whole story there, the case that we're trying to make, I'm trying to make, and my colleagues have tried to make, is that by virtue of just being humans, we've got this sort of natural disposition toward religious belief. What Macaulay does in his book, and I think very convincingly, is show that science is different. Now, it may be that we have natural disposition to explore the world around us. There have been some very prominent developmental psychologists who have made that case. They've used the language of scientists in the crib. Alison Gopnik is at Berkeley is very famous for this, that babies are a little bit like scientists in that they actively explore the world. They're generating what look like theories, in a sense, like they form some kind of representation about how things work in the world. They test it out by interacting with the world, and then they revise based on the evidence. So it looks a little bit like science, but I think she's being a little provocative there too. What Macaulay argues is actual doing of modern science isn't just empirically exploring the world. It's pushing back against a lot of our natural ways of thinking. And so he argues that modern science is actually very unnatural. And it requires a lot of cultural scaffolding, he calls it, to get it going. It requires number systems. It requires literacy. It requires guilds. It requires lab equipment. They're all of these things. Why? Because we have to use the sciences to, back to earlier in our conversation, do things like override our tendency to form self-serving biases. Override our tendency to think we know more than we do. Override our tendency to to ignore the errors in our own arguments and the weakness in our own evidence base. The sciences have developed as sort of social, cultural mechanisms for sort of fixing the way that we naturally might go sideways, especially when we're studying things that are not the kinds of objects and interactions that our nature is best tuned for, especially the very large, the very small, and the very complex. Those are because we're bad at statistics naturally, right? We don't do that well. We don't detect patterns with the right degree of fidelity in really complex kinds of spaces. And that's what the sciences are really good at. So while there may be some natural impetus for exploring the natural world, I think that's true. How we go about exploring the natural world using these tools of the sciences actually turns out to run very much counter to our natural dispositions. And that's why it takes so long to learn how to do it well, and why even really good scientists can make mistakes and do things that we go, well, that wasn't very scientific. But yeah, doing sciences is hard because it runs against the way that our minds naturally work. How was that? Did I get it?
I mean, I was sitting there, that was some fodder for me. I was really enjoying that because I couldn't see where you were going initially, and then you took a U-turn, and I was like, oh, I get it. Yep, I see. I see this.
We have a relief. Okay, good.
No, that was brilliant. That was brilliant. So we're coming to near the end of the interview. I have a question for you, which isn't covered in either of your books. It's just a
Sure.
general question. And this is in regards to how faith, and when I say faith, I'm using it in a very broad sense. So in a way, Alfred Russel Wallace can also be seen to have a faith because he believed in a sort of occultism and spirituality, and he had these very interesting ideas. So when it comes to the Darwinian understanding from a purely naturalistic perspective, so I'm not talking about Asa Gray's understanding or Francis Collins' understanding, which is a theistic evolutionary perspective. I'm talking about a naturalistic, so there's no God, there's nothing, it's all physical, right?
Right.
Would you say that if somebody started off with that type of naturalistic evolutionary thinking, it would curtail scientific inquiry because it would limit what human beings think they can achieve or what they think is important, and juxtaposing that against, say, a faith-driven scientific inquiry, whether that's a sort of theistic evolution or it's intelligent design or something else, somebody who believes in God or spirituality in some way, then those epistemic barriers are broken and they're more likely to be having an unbridled advancement towards scientific discovery.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. And I think that is a productive line to be thinking about. So I'm inclined to say yes. But what do I mean? I think that what we need is a high degree of worldview or viewpoint diversity in the sciences. We need people coming to the sciences from lots of different, using the term you were using, faith perspectives in a broad sense, because they incline us towards some questions over others, some assumptions over others. And if we sort of honestly, open-mindedly move into that space, then we're going to make discoveries, even if they aren't the ones we thought we were going to make. So I'll give a little concrete example. When I was a doctoral student, very well regarded, established psychological scientist, Daryl Bem, had started doing his work on parapsychology. Now, interestingly, as far as I know, when he got into this, he was not a believer at all in anything like what he ended up studying, which was psi phenomena. This is just a term for what is more commonly called extrasensory perception, but the scientists who get into this, they often don't use that term, and I think for a very good reason. I think his view was there could be forms of perception that we don't understand yet.
Yeah.
That then mystics might call ESP or something, clairvoyance or similar to that. As far as I know, he's a naturalist, and he thinks there are going to be natural mechanisms for how these things work. And he had presented some of his initial sort of investigations of these labs doing this work, and that there were at least some scientific paradigms that he couldn't find what they had done wrong, and he was finding through meta-analysis small effect sizes, but relatively reliable ones. But he wasn't proposing this because he was a big believer in ESP or something like that. He was just open-minded enough to say, this is something we ought to look at, because some other scientists from these perspectives who really do think this is a real thing have given us at least some evidence. They're not trying to destroy our naturalistic paradigm altogether. Now, that's the fear. But one of the interesting things about his presentation and why it has stuck with me is that he handled all of his colleagues' objections to the empirical data, to the experimental protocols, to all of this stuff, just deftly. I recall him handling these brilliantly in the discussion after his presentation. And he persuaded no one. So he did everything right, and he persuaded no one. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with it, but refused to believe it. Well, maybe there are good reasons to refuse to believe it. I don't have a dog in this fight, but I bring it up as an illustration of how, because we can come to the sciences with such entrenched viewpoints, we need lots of different people's viewpoints so that new ideas get on the table and new areas of inquiry get opened up. A success story, I think, has actually been the area of psychology. It's now called positive psychology, but really it's the psychological study of character strengths, virtues, happiness, well-being, being less miserable, instead of the psychological study of how do we get sick people well to okay. It's how do we get okay people to awesome, is kind of what it is. So it's the study of gratitude and forgiveness and humility. And it's one of the few areas of psychological scientists where people of faith are overrepresented. Psychology is a very secular area, psychological science, very secular. Positive psychology is not. And that's not an accident. It's because people of faith are bringing their faith traditions to say, I come from a tradition where humility really matters. I'm interested in how that works. I'm from a tradition in which gratitude is a high virtue. how does that work? What does it do for people? And it's become a very fruitful and productive scientific area that I think would not have developed had not those people from faith backgrounds let their faith perspective fuel their scientific discovery. So I think we need everybody bringing in a much more self-reflective kind of way, what are my values, my commitments to doing the scientific inquiry that shape and inform, inflect how I do the sciences? Bring them to the table and have an openness about honestly doing the scientific work with those values in mind so that we make more discoveries together. So yeah, that's kind of, in some ways, that's the message behind the message of the book too.
Brilliant. That's a wonderful note to end the interview on. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. In fact, that's something I'm going to be thinking about after this live stream. That's and I'm going to look into that area as well. I didn't actually know that people of faith were overrepresented in that particular field. So thank you so much, Professor Barrett. Is there anything? Is there anything you'd like to share with the viewers before we end about maybe your upcoming research or books?
No, I'm still excited about the new book there. I really would value, as people read the book or interact with it, to shoot me messages, questions, comments, because I am working on sort of a more developed, more advanced version of the book that would be for people who are further down their career and where we can go a little bit deeper into some of the thornier issues. So I'd really value hearing, well, what are those thorny issues that people are facing as they're, coming to the sciences, being self-reflective about how their worldview does inform and motivate their scientific work. So I welcome those kinds of comments and questions, and that would help me write the next book faster, I think. So
thank you for that, Professor Barrett. Thank you for giving us your time. I hope everyone enjoyed the interview, and we say good night for now, and hopefully I'll have Professor Barrett back maybe when he has his new book out. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
My pleasure.